Welcome to the Calculating Meat Alternate and Grain Components webinar. In this webinar, we're going to be discussing how to calculate the meat alternate and grain components to ensure that you are meeting the minimum contributing amounts to meat meal pattern requirements. During this webinar, we're going to look at several different bits of documentation that you can use to determine the contributing amounts of your meat alternate and grain items, to ensure that you are meeting those minimum grain and meat alternate component requirements. The first example we're going to look at is using a USDA food fact sheet. These are available on our DESI FNS website. We're also going to use the USDA food buying guide, which is also linked on our DESI FNS website. We're going to use product formulation statements, which can be obtained from your manufacturers for each of the products that you are working with. Then we're going to look at calculating a grain recipe from scratch. So looking at a recipe for a grain product and determining the contributing amount of that grain component. And then the last thing we're going to do is look at Exhibit A and determine how to find that grain contribution from a processed grain product. So when we are calculating a meat alternate or a grain component from a recipe, we need to know what ingredient we're working with, the amount or weight of the product that we're working with, the yield of that product, and we can find that by taking the ounce equivalent divided by the actual weight of the product, and then the number of servings that that recipe is going to contribute. So the first example we're going to look at is a recipe for chicken and noodles, and in this recipe we are going to use the USDA brown boxed diced chicken. So here's a snippet of the crediting and yield information for this USDA brown boxed diced chicken. On the second bullet you can see the CN crediting, which is the child nutrition crediting. And it states that approximately 1 ounce of diced chicken credits as 1 ounce equivalent of meat alternate. So in order to determine the yield, we take the ounce equivalent divided by the actual weight, which in this example, both of those values are 1. So we are just going to simply have a yield of 1 for this example. So going back to the 4 bits of information that we need to know to credit this recipe, the ingredient that we're working with is the USDA diced chicken. In this example, we're going to be using 6 pounds, 6 ounces of this product. The yield is going to be 1, which we determined on the last slide. And in this example, we're going to be making 50 servings using this recipe. So the first step in calculating the contributing amount of our meat alternate is going to be to convert the amount of our product to ounces. So in the last slide, we said we had 6 pounds and 6 ounces. So in order to convert the pounds into ounces, we need to multiply the number of pounds by 16 because there are 16 ounces in 1 pound. So 6 times 16 is going to be 96 ounces. Then we need to add in those extra ounces. So we had 6 pounds, 6 ounces. So we need to add those 6 extra ounces to our 96, which gives us a total of 102 ounces for our recipe. The next step is to multiply our ounces by our yield, which in this example we just had a yield of 1. So 102 times 1 is 102 ounce equivalents. And then we need to divide that by our number of servings, which was 50. So 102 ounce equivalents divided by 50 servings gives us 2.04 ounce equivalents per serving. And then we're always going to round that down if it does not meet the next quarter ounce equivalent. So since we only had 2.04, we're going to round that down to 2 ounce equivalents per serving for this recipe. The next example we're going to work with is using the USDA food buying guide, and we're going to be working with ground beef to determine the meat alternate component for a spaghetti and meat sauce recipe. So here's a snippet of the information that I obtained via the USDA Food Buying Guide. You'll see on here that I have two different products. However, if you look at the food as purchased, and you'll see that the description is exactly the same. The only difference you'll see is whenever we get over to the servings per purchase unit, which is the second to last column, and the very last column, the serving size per meal contribution. So the crediting amount for these two items is exactly the same. However, one of these lines is telling us how many 1 ounce equivalents are going to be contributed by 1 pound of this product, whereas the other one is telling us how many 1.5 ounce equivalents are being contributed from 1 pound. So just for simplicity, we're going to look at the 1 ounce equivalent line, which is the first line. So like I mentioned previously, to determine the yield, we need to take the ounce equivalents divided by the actual weight of the product. So this 1 pound of this ingredient, so 16 ounces, is going to contribute 12 ounce equivalents. So we're going to take 12 divided by 16 ounces to give us our yield, which is going to be 0.75. So again, going back to the 4 bits of information we need to know, the ingredient we're working with is 15% fat ground beef. In this example, we're going to be using 8 pounds, 8 ounces. The yield, which we just determined on our last slide, is going to be 0.75. And the servings we're working with is going to be 50 in this example. So going through the same steps that we did in the previous example, we're going to start by converting our amount to ounces. So taking the pounds and multiplying by 16 ounces, since there are 16 ounces in 1 pound. So 8 pounds times 16 ounces is going to give us 128 ounces. Adding in the extra 8 ounces that the recipe calls for, so we have a total of 136 ounces of ground beef in our recipe. Multiplying that amount by our yield, which was 0.75, so 136 times 0.75, so we have 102 ounce equivalents of ground beef in our recipe. And then dividing that by the number of servings, which was 50. So for this example, we have 2.04 ounce equivalents per serving, which just like in the last example, since we don't meet that next quarter of an ounce equivalent, we need to round that down to the nearest ounce equivalent. So this recipe is going to contribute 2 ounce equivalents of meat alternate for a meal pattern. Okay, so our next example, we are going to look at a product formulation statement, or see and label. Both of these documents are going to give you essentially the same information. They're going to tell you the weight of the product and how many meat alternate or grain ounce equivalents are going to be contributed to the meal pattern. So in this example, I just took a bit of the product formulation statement, and on the last line of this example, you can see it says the serving size is 4.03 ounces. And then if you go over a little bit, it tells you that that serving size is going to contribute 2 ounces of meat alternate and 1 ounce equivalent of grain. So just like in the last example, to determine our yield, we need to take the ounce equivalents divided by the actual weight of the product. In this example, we're going to be working with the meat alternate component. So we have 2 ounce equivalents that's going to be divided by 4.3, which was the actual weight. So we have a yield of 0.47. So in this example, we're going to put in our 4 bits of information we need. The ingredient we're working with is the popcorn chicken. The amount that the recipe is going to call for is 13 pounds, 7 ounces of this ingredient. The yield was 0.47. And the number of servings in this example is going to be 50. So going through the exact same steps again, the first step is always to convert that amount to ounces. So we'll take the 13 pounds that the recipe calls for, multiply it by 16 ounces to give us 208 ounces. add in the extra ounces that the recipe calls for, which was 7. So 208 plus 7 will give us 215 ounces of popcorn chicken for our recipe. Multiply that by the yield, which was 0.47. So 215 times 0.47 equals 101.05 ounce equivalents. And then dividing that by the number of servings, which was 50. So 101.05 ounce equivalents divided by 50 servings is 2.02 ounce equivalents. And then again, rounding that down to the nearest ounce equivalent to get 2 ounce equivalents per serving. Okay, so now we're going to go through this exact same example, but we're going to be determining the grain contribution for this ingredient. So instead of looking at the meat alternate contribution, we're going to look at the grain serving. So we're going to take the ounce equivalents of grain, which is 1, and divide it by the actual weight of the product, which was 4.3 ounces. So our yield for the grain component is going to be 0.23. So the ingredient we're working with, again, is the popcorn chicken. The amount is going to be exactly the same. However, our yield is going to be different. So in this one, I actually bumped our yield out by 2 decimal points. You can bump that out to get a more accurate determination of what your ounce equivalent is going to be for your recipe. Most times I round down just because I'm working with shorter numbers, but getting that full decimal is going to give you a more accurate determination of what your ounce equivalent is. So in this one, I went ahead and bumped it out 2 more decimals to get a more accurate reading, because when I shortened that decimal and rounded it down to 0.23, it actually didn't give me quite the amount of ounce equivalents that I needed for the recipe. So you can always do that and just document how you determined that ounce equivalent, and so we can always check your math whenever you receive your administrative review. And then again, the number of servings is going to be 50. So going through all the exact same steps again, we're going to convert it to ounces. So 13 times 16 plus the extra 7 ounces to give us 215 ounces, which is the same amount that we had in the last example. Multiplying by the yield, which here is where it's a little bit different. So multiplying the 215 ounces by 0.2326 gives us 50 ounce equivalents. And then dividing that by the number of servings, which was 50, which is going to give us 1 ounce equivalent for this recipe. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit and look at calculating our grain component from a from-scratch recipe. So we need to know a little bit different information for these examples. For these, we need to know the ingredient we're working with, the amount of that ingredient, whether it is by weight or volume. We just have different calculations that are involved depending on if you're working with weight or volume, but you can do either or. And then the number of servings in our recipe. So this is the list of grain conversions that we're going to be working with in these next 2 examples, and I will bring some of these conversions with us as we go through these and refer back to them so that you have them to reference. So in our first example, we're going to be looking at calculating a grain contribution by using the weight of your product. So in this example, we have a recipe for a whole grain dinner roll that uses 2 pounds of whole wheat flour. So when we're looking at weight, we always need to convert that to grams as our first step. So over here, you'll see that I've given you your conversion for that amount. So we're going to take 2 pounds times 453.6 to convert that to grams. So 2 pounds is going to be equal to 907.2 grams. Then we're going to divide our grams by the number of servings in our recipe, which in this example we're using 100. So 907.2 grams divided by 100 equals 9.072 grams per serving. And then divide that by the creditable grains per serving. This is always going to be 16 for any of your from scratch grain conversions. So 9.072 grams divided by 16 creditable grains is going to give us 0.562 ounce equivalents of whole wheat flour in this recipe. However, we don't want to round this down just yet because we're also using enriched flour in this same recipe so that we have a whole grain rich product is what we're shooting for, but you don't have to have 100% whole grain in order to have a whole grain rich product. So we're using a little bit of enriched flour and a little bit of the whole wheat flour. So the first step is the same as converting your whole wheat flour. We're going to convert the weight of our ingredient to grams. However, in this example, we have both pounds and ounces. So in order to convert the pound over into ounces, we multiply that by the 453 grams. And since it's just one, we have 453.6 grams here. And then we need to add in the 12 ounces, but first we need to convert that to grams as well. So you'll see over here on the conversions, I've brought over the number of ounces of ingredient multiplied by 28.35 grams is going to convert that. So 12 times 28.35 grams is 340.2 grams, and we'll just add those together to get the total weight in grams of this ingredient. So we have a total of 793.8 grams of enriched flour in this recipe. Then we're going to divide that number of grams by the number of servings, which was 100. So that gives us 7.938 grams per serving. And then again, divide that by the creditable grains per serving, which, like I said, is always 16. So we have 7.938 grams divided by 16 creditable grains. So we have 0.4961 ounce equivalents. So now, since we have two different grain ingredients, we need to add those two ingredients together to get our total ounce equivalent for our recipe. And at this point, if you are wanting this ingredient or menu item to be a whole grain item, you need to make sure that the ounce equivalent of your whole grain ingredient is higher than the ounce equivalent of your enriched or white flour ingredient. So here you can see 0.562 is higher than 0.4961, so this will count as a whole grain rich product. And when we add these two ounce equivalents together, we get a total of 1.0581 ounce equivalents, which, like we mentioned before, if it doesn't equal or reach that 0.25 ounce equivalent marker, you need to round it back down. So this is going to count as a 1 ounce equivalent whole grain dinner roll for our menu. So now we're going to look at converting our from scratch grain recipes when we're working with volume, so cups and quarts and such. So in this example, and the reason that we have to do the whole wheat flour and the enriched flour separately or different grain ingredients separately is because the weight of 1 cup of these different ingredients weighs a little bit different. So here, the whole wheat flour, 1 cup is equal to 120 grams. So in order to convert our volume to grams, we have to multiply the number of cups we have by 120. So since we have 1 quart and 2.66 cups, we need to convert our quart over to cups so we just know how many cups we're working with. Since there are 4 cups in a quart, we're just going to add 4 to the number of cups that we have, which will give us a total of 6.66 cups of whole wheat flour. Then we're going to convert our cups to grams, so multiplying our 6.66 by 120 grams, which will equal 799.2 grams of whole wheat flour. dividing our grams by the number of servings, which in this example is going to be 50. So we have 15.984 grams of whole wheat flour per serving. And then dividing that by the creditable grains, which again is always going to be 16. So we have 0.99 ounce equivalents of whole wheat flour in our cinnamon roll. But just like the last example, we're going to be using enriched flour as well. So again, the first step is to convert our amount, which is 1 quart and 2.25 cups, to cups. So again, since there are 4 cups in 1 quart, we're going to have 6.25 cups. And then the conversion factor for this is a little bit different. 1 cup of enriched flour is equal to 125 grams. So to convert our cups to grams, we're going to take 6.25 times 125 grams, which will give us 781.25 grams for our recipe. Dividing that by the number of servings, which was 50. So we have 15.625 grams per serving. And then dividing that by our creditable grains, which again is always 16. So we have 0.9765 ounce equivalents of enriched flour in our cinnamon roll recipe. So again, we're going to add these two together to get our total ounce equivalent for this menu item. So we have 1.9665 ounce equivalents of grains in this recipe. Since this does fall just a bit shy of the 2 ounce equivalent, which would be the next quarter ounce up, we do need to round this down to 1.75 ounce equivalent. However, if you get to this point and you see that you're just shy of that marker, you can go back and modify your recipe just a little bit to make sure that you're getting that extra 0.04 ounce equivalent to reach that 2 ounce equivalent if that's what you're needing for your recipe. Okay, so our last example is going to be looking at Exhibit A. And to do this, all we need to know is what's on the nutrition facts label of our product. Okay, so in this example, we're going to be looking at a cereal bar. And all we need to know is the weight per serving, and then we need to reference Exhibit A. So here's a snippet of the cereal bar nutrition facts label, and you can see the very first line says our serving size, which is 40 grams. And then also you will want to show us the ingredient list if we ask for a nutrition facts label for your processed grain ingredients, because we'll want to know if that is going to be counting as a whole grain rich item for your menu, or if it's going to be a non-whole grain item. And providing your ingredient list will give us the documentation we need for that. So we need to remember that our serving size for the cereal bar is 40 grams, and that's what we're going to use to reference on our Exhibit A. So when we look at Exhibit A, there's going to be several different groups listed. And under each of those groups, it's going to list the different processed grain items that fall under each group. So when we looked at our ingredient list, it did not list any candy pieces or fruit pieces or anything like that. So we're going to say that this is a cereal bar plain, so a breakfast bar or granola bar. There is a cereal bar listed under Group E as well, so make sure that you are finding the correct grain item when you're referencing your Exhibit A. So like we mentioned before, this one cereal bar is going to be 40 grams. And to convert our item over to ounce equivalents, we'll look over here in this next column where it says ounce equivalents for Group D, and we'll see that 1 ounce equivalent is equal to 55 grams or 2 ounces. So to convert our 40 gram cereal bar over to ounce equivalents, we'll take the actual weight of the product divided by the ounce equivalents, so 55 grams per ounce equivalent, which is going to give us 0.72. And since that does not meet that 0.75 quarter ounce equivalent, we do need to round that down to 0.5 ounce equivalents. However, if you do have a processed grain product and you were under the impression that it would be contributing more than the amount that Exhibit A shows, Exhibit A was created to be very much an estimate on how a grain product contributes to your meal pattern. However, your manufacturer is going to have a lot more information and insight on the content of that processed grain product. So you would at this point reach out to your manufacturer and ask for a product formulation statement, and that's going to give us a more precise determination of how this product contributes to the meal pattern requirements. And we'll always take that product formulation statement over what we would have determined on Exhibit A because, like I said, this is very much an estimate. So if this isn't quite what you thought it would be, always reach out to your manufacturer and get a product formulation statement. And that concludes the webinar for calculating our meats and grains from scratch. We will also have a webinar available showing you how to use various tools that are available on our DESE F&S website for calculating our meats and grains as well. So if you are interested in that, please view our Calculating Meats and Grains Tools webinar that will be available on our website. If you have any questions, please give us a call. We'd be happy to help. Thank you.